Okay, so I want to start with a quotation. This was published in a special issue of the Minuit Journal Philosophy in 1995, just a few months after Deleuze died, by a guy called André Bernot. Deleuze, philosopher, son of Diogenes and Hypatia, sojourned at Lyon. Nothing is known of his life. He lived to be very old, even though he was often very ill. This illustrated what he himself had said. There are lives in which the difficulties verge on the prodigious. He defined as active any force that goes to the end of its power. This, he said, is the opposite of the law. Thus he lived, always going further than he believed he could. Even though he had explicated Chrysippus, it is above all his steadfastness that earned him the name of a Stoic. Chrysippus is the third head of the Stoic school from the 3rd century BC, and the most important of the early Stoics for the systematization of Stoic doctrine. Okay. Now, this passage, which, although it's labelled Sudas, which is the name of a 9th century Byzantine encyclopedia, in fact is much more of a homage to the lives of the philosophers that one finds in Diogenes Laertius, in which one finds anecdotes and doxographical fragments of philosophical theories combined with one another. Now, what's quite striking to me about this passage is that Bernot seems to be suggesting that there's some kind of deeper Stoicism within Deleuze, beyond his passing comments on the Stoics that we find in the Logic of Sense. Even though Deleuze has explicated Chrysippus in the Logic of Sense, it's above all for his steadfastness that earned him the name of a Stoic. There's a suggestion, it seems, that there's some kind of deeper Stoic attitude at work within Deleuze's philosophy. And it's this thought that there might be some kind of deeper Stoicism at work within Deleuze's philosophy that I'm interested in. I'm not so interested in his explicit comments on the Stoics, although obviously we'll discuss those. Now, my first thesis on Deleuze's Stoicism is how the Stoics might fit into Deleuze's broader philosophical genealogy. There are a number of ways in which Deleuze tells a story about the various thinkers that have influenced him, and if the Stoics are going to be particularly significant for his philosophy, then it's going to be important for us to be able to locate them within the various genealogies that he maps. In interviews in dialogues, Deleuze famously says that as a student he was bludgeoned to death by the history of philosophy, forced to study at great length philosophers such as Plato and Descartes and Hegel, philosophers who he didn't find particularly congenial, and his early works in the history of philosophy seem primarily concerned to look for those thinkers that offer some alternative philosophical tradition outside the one that he was taught. The tradition that he wants to reject, this tradition of Plato, Descartes and Hegel, is one in which priority is given to abstractions, Deleuze suggests, abstractions such as the one, the whole, the subject. And what Deleuze wants to do is get away from that tradition and instead affirm some kind of empiricist tradition, some kind of pluralist tradition. Hence his first book on Hume, his interest in William James, even his glowing remarks about Bertrand Russell that crop up from time to time. And the key refrain in Deleuze's attempt to construct some kind of empiricist tradition within the history of philosophy that escapes this tradition that he was taught in the 1940s, the key refrain is that the abstract explains nothing, but must itself be explained. Okay. That comes either from William James or from Whitehead, or possibly it may be found in both. So this is the key refrain that Deleuze talks about when he tries to outline his own position within a certain philosophical trajectory coming out of the history of philosophy. And the Stoics, as we'll see shortly, are of course empiricists and do directly oppose what they take to be Platonic abstractions. Okay, so the Stoics are can find a place in this empiricist tradition that Deleuze outlines. The other key phrase that one finds when Deleuze is mapping out his philosophical forebears is he says that all of his interests revolved around what he calls the great Spinoza-Nietzsche equation. And without wanting to go into a lot of details, both Spinoza and Nietzsche have been presented as embodying certain Stoic themes within their work. And Bergson, too, of course, is a third key figure for Deleuze. And in Bergson, again, we can find broadly Stoic themes, the idea that the cosmos is a living process. Bergson's conception of time has precedent in the theory of time attributed to Chrysippus, and particularly the theory of time that we find in Marcus Aurelius. Okay, so the Stoics can be seen as intellectual forebears to a number of the key figures that Deleuze is drawn to, and to situate the Stoics within that tradition is not a ridiculous proposition by any means. Okay. So not only do the Stoics deserve a place within this trajectory, but arguably they deserve a place right at the beginning of this trajectory. They are, he suggests, the first philosophers of immanence who prefigure Spinoza and Nietzsche, and the first to reverse Platonism. Okay. So this leads me on to my second thesis, and this is what we can broadly call ontology, and in particular, this idea of reversing Platonism. Okay, so as I've said, Deleuze suggests the Stoics are the first to reverse Platonism, this being the task for modern philosophy. Now, for Deleuze, Platonism is primarily a philosophy of judgment. Okay, so he suggests that the key dualism within Platonism isn't the one that we might think between unchanging ideas that have being and a world of becoming that's constantly changing and isn't accorded the status of being. Instead, for Deleuze, the dualism within Platonism is one between rival claimants. Okay, so in the Sophist, Plato talks about appearance making and likeness making. Okay, he suggests these are two distinct arts, and his concern is to choose between these two different types. And in Deleuze's discussion of Platonism, in his 1966 essay, which he then revises and prints as an appendix to the Logic of Sense, he talks about true copies and false copies. And the key task for Platonism, Deleuze suggests, is to try to distinguish between true copies and false copies. And in the dialogue, the Sophist, of course, the main task of the dialogue as a whole is to try to show how we can distinguish between the true philosopher who deserves to run the city and the Sophist. Okay, so So for Deleuze, the real dualism between within Platonic ontology is this dualism between true copies and false copies. And the ideas come up in here simply as a way of guaranteeing that we make the right choice. But the dualism is not between here and here, it's between here and here. Okay. So according to Deleuze, this is what Platonism is. It's a philosophy of judgment. Okay. So one might think that how do you overturn or reverse this kind of Platonism? Well, it's quite simple, he seems to suggest. You simply deny the existence of the ideas, and then you're unable to choose between the true and false copies. And the false copies, which are the simulacra, can then achieve a status similar to the true copies. Okay. Now, one would expect this in this particular section, I'm going to be slightly critical of Deleuze in a number of ways. In the light of all of that, you might say, okay, if the Stoics are the first to reverse Platonism, then they're going to be the first to overturn this dualism by denying ideas and dissolving this dualism between true and false copies. But in fact, what Deleuze does is attribute something quite different to the Stoics. So Stoic ontology, broadly speaking, draws a distinction between bodies which they say exist, and then a certain list of incorporeals which they say subsist. So the key phrase within Stoic ontology is only bodies exist. However, in order to give a convincing materialist ontology, the claim only bodies exist isn't enough on its own, because there are a number of things which aren't bodies, but the one needs to say are in some sense real. And one example of this would be place. Okay? Another would be time. Another would be void. So you might need to give some kind of account of void within your ontology, but you're not going to want to say it's a body. And because they claim that only bodies exist, then they'll need to have some other kind of ontological category for these, for void, for instance, and these other incorporeals. And the fourth of the canonical incorporeals is probably best translated as sayables, the lector, which is the meaning or sense expressed within a statement, which clearly isn't material, but again, one would need in order to give a fully rounded ontology. And of course, this idea of incorporeal sense is something that Deleuze is particularly interested in the logic of sense. Okay? So the Stoics unite these two ontological categories under a highest genus that is usually labelled something, T. Okay, so to be something at all. So everything that there is within Stoic ontology falls under this highest genus of something. And it's often suggested that while bodies exist and incorporeals subsist, the category of something, we might say, covers the real. And it covers only particulars, it's claimed. Okay, so only bodies exist, only particulars are real, and the incorporeals are therefore real, but they don't exist. Now, for the Stoics, anything that doesn't fall within this scheme is nothing whatsoever. And because the highest genus is identified with particularity, then universal concepts, fall out of this schema. And so, although this isn't part of the schema at all, there's also a description of things that are uti, things that are not something. Okay? And uti could also be translated as just simply nothing. Okay, nothing at all. And the things that fall under this category for the Stoics are Platonic ideas. Okay? The other things that fall under this category of not something are hallucinations, the dreams and ramblings of madmen, and so on and so forth, the products of the imagination. And for the Stoics, Platonic ideas have that kind of ontological status. They're dismissed out of court altogether. Okay? So that sounds as if the Stoics are simply rejecting Platonic ideas completely, which sounds as if it's what Deleuze wants them to do. In fact, what he says is something quite different. He says, the Stoics are the first to reverse Platonism and to bring about a radical inversion. For if bodies, with their states, qualities, and quantities, assume all the characteristics of substance and cause, conversely, the characteristics of the idea, the Platonic idea, are relegated to the other side. That is, to this impassive extra being, which is sterile and on the surface of things. The ideational, or the incorporeal, can no longer be anything other than an effect. Okay? So what Deleuze is effectively saying is that the Platonic ideas are no longer identified with existence, but they do fall under the category of the incorporeals. In fact, so he seems to suggest that what the Stoics do is they literally reverse Platonic ontology. They turn it on its head. So existence is attributed to bodies rather than ideas, and ideas merely subsist. He thinks of ideas as something that would fall under the category of sayables, I think. In fact, the Platonic reversal of Platonism is far more radical than that. And in fact, the Platonic reversal of Platonism, rejecting Platonic ideas out of their ontological scheme altogether, is in fact what it seems he needs for his own reversal of Platonism. But the way in which he described Platonism in his 1966 article, and the way in which he discusses the way in which the Stoics reverse Platonism in the logical sense, don't in fact gel at all. But despite the rather messy way in which this all hangs together, the general claim that the Stoics reverse Platonism in the sense he wants does actually hold up. Okay. So that's my second thesis on Deleuze's Stoicism. The Stoics are the first to reverse Platonism, and for Deleuze, reversing Platonism is the principal task of modern philosophy, he suggests, as a good Nietzschean. Okay. My third thesis. My third thesis is on the idea of practical philosophy. Now, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the work of a French scholar called Pierre Hadot, who wrote a book that published in English in 1995 called Philosophy as a Way of Life. More recently, Hadot has published another book called What is Ancient Philosophy?, in which he describes the way in which philosophy was conceived in antiquity. And for Hadot, philosophy in antiquity was a way of life, he suggests. Or another phrase that he uses is philosophy in antiquity was a spiritual exercise, a series of spiritual exercises, exercises for the soul that are analogous to the exercises that we use to train the body. Okay. In fact, I think it would be a mistake to go with Hadot that far and say that philosophy was merely a series of spiritual exercises, because if that were the case, as Martha Nussbaum notes in some comments, I think directed towards Foucault, if that were the case, then what about argument? Ancient philosophers are clearly very interested in arguments. If philosophy is merely a series of spiritual exercises designed to transform us into some kind of wise man or sage, then how do we distinguish between the ancient philosopher? How do we distinguish between Socrates and the kind of mystical religious nutcase on the street corner who doesn't have any arguments whatsoever, but would very much like to get his hands on your soul and transform it for you if he can do? Okay, so how do we draw a distinction between those two? And the Stoics, in particular, put a lot of thought into this idea. How should we conceive philosophy? And so this one half of one of my 6 theses is the bit that turned out to be my PhD. Okay, so the Stoics conceived philosophy as an art or craft. Okay, as a technique. Okay, and as with other arts and crafts, they suggest that 2 things are required. On the one hand, one needs to study the principles underpinning the art or craft, the logoi. But on the other hand, one also has to engage in a series of exercises, ascesis. Okay, so if you think about a medical student, the medical student has to go to class and learn all about medical theory, but medical theory on its own isn't enough in order for one to have expertise in medicine, because medicine isn't a theoretical discipline, it's a practical discipline, it's an art or a craft. And so after the medical student has studied his principles, he then has to go and have some kind of exercise or training in order to digest those principles, so that he then gains a kind of technical expertise which is different from mere theoretical expertise. Okay, so for the Stoics, philosophy is an art or craft involving both rational arguments at the level of logoi, but also these spiritual exercises which are designed to digest those principles so that they transform one's soul, so that acting according to those principles becomes second nature. Okay? And this is what Hadot is particularly interested in, and he outlines this in his book, What is Ancient Philosophy? Now, in a footnote on the very first page of this book, he says, what I'm about to say has absolutely nothing to do with the conception of philosophy that Deleuze and Guattari outline in their book called What is Philosophy, namely the creation of concepts. This couldn't be more different to the conception of philosophy that you'll find outlined by them. Okay, so it seems to be that I might be at a bit of an impasse here. Okay, but notwithstanding what Deleuze and Guattari say and what is philosophy about philosophy being the creation of concepts, I would say that throughout Deleuze's corpus, what we find is another conception of philosophy at work as well. A conception of philosophy that's far more practical and far closer to the ancient conception of philosophy. Okay? So in the logic of sense, for instance, he talks about the Stoic philosopher being a being of the surface who manages to unite biography with bibliography so that thought and life are conjoined in a single process. He talks about Spinoza, of course, as a practical philosopher, the philosopher who teaches the philosopher how to be a non-philosopher, he suggests. And he says in a number of places that the only aim of writing is ultimately our life. And in an interview with Foucault, published in 1972, Intellectuals and Power, he gives an account of the way in which a theory should be understood as a toolbox. Okay? A theory should be put to work in a series of relays and connections with practice and not isolated from it. Okay? And just a few years after that, Foucault, in the preface to Anti-Oedipus, famously presents the work of Anti-Oedipus as an art of living and a guide to life, a manual that people can pick up and use in order to transform the way they live. So, notwithstanding what Deleuze and Guattari tell us explicitly in that book written in 1991, for the last 20, 25 years before that, Deleuze has constantly been telling us that, in fact, philosophy is something very practical. Philosophy is something that should transform our very lives. Writing and life should be constantly intertwined with one another. In short, I'd say he gives us an incredibly ancient conception of philosophy. So I would argue that Deleuze's conception of philosophy shares a lot in common with ancient and particularly Stoic conceptions of philosophy. Now, it seems to me that if we wanted to look for examples of that kind of idea of philosophy as a way of life at work within Deleuze's various books, then the two volumes that he wrote with Guattari, Anti-Oedipus and 1,000 Plateaus, seem to look as if they fit closest to this kind of model. I mean, he famously said that he wanted to write a book that teenagers would just pick up and read and it would transform their lives and so on and so forth. And it didn't matter if you understood every single proposition as long as it had the right kind of effective quality and so on and so forth. So if we wanted to look for this kind of practical conception of philosophy at work, it looks as if those books are going to be the best place to look. Now, in the opening pages of Anti-Oedipus, we're told that the project at hand, and this point made in relation to a number of references to the German Romantics, surprisingly, is the project at hand is to overcome the boundaries between the individual and nature. Okay? The aim is to try to experience nature as nature. And this idea is developed particularly in the how do you make yourself a body without organs plateau in 1,000 Plateaus. And it seems to me that here we find some strikingly Stoic material. In fact, I'll argue that the most Stoic material that you'll find in Deleuze's work is actually in 1,000 Plateaus, rather than the logic of sense. Okay? So what do we find in that book as a whole? Well, we find a conception of nature as a process of flows of matter, which encompasses both the animate and the inanimate. We're told that everything that appears to be stable is merely the product of a process of stratification. In other words, only momentary pauses within the continual flows of matter and energy. We're told that the only real difference between all of the things that we experience in nature are differing speeds and slownesses. Okay? And all of this is just straight out of Marcus Aurelius. Okay? If you want the idea that everything that we experience that is that seems to be permanent and stable and important in our lives, whatever that may be, is in fact just a momentary solidification in the great Heraclitean flows of matter that constitute the cosmos. Okay? So the ethical project, if I can use that word, or the practical project might be better, the practical project for Deleuze and Guattari in 1,000 Plateaus is for us to be able to realise this, to realise that all of the apparently stable is in fact only ever a momentary pause in a continual changing process. Okay? And of course the schizophrenic and the drug user and the alcoholic are all people who manage to do this, but with some rather unfortunate side effects. Okay? So how do we try to capture this experience? How do we try to overcome this, the apparent stability that we tend to see? Well, Deleuze suggests that we need to develop a kind of a geological conception of time. And for this he goes to Brodel, and Brodel's concepts of the long duration and world time. He says we need to develop a kind of a geo-philosophy which should be understood in exactly the same sense as Brodel's geo-history. So we need to move up a level and try to conceive the cosmos from this geological conception of time. And from this higher perspective, we'll be able to see that the apparently stable things that surround us are actually in a continual process of movement. So, for instance, Marcus Aurelius will make comments along the lines of, if we could reach the right kind of cosmic perspective from high enough, we would realise that the eternal city of Rome is not that eternal after all, and it will fall just as the Persian Empire fell, and we need to bear this in mind in all that we do. Okay. In the middle of all of this, in the middle of this, how do you make yourself body without organs plateau, when they're describing this process, there are two lone words that slot in without any footnote whatsoever. The words are spermatikos logos, which is, of course, a key concept from Stoic physics. And I think this is a gesture from Deleuze, presumably, rather than Guattari, that he's thinking about Stoic physics when he's writing this, this section of the text. Okay? The spermatikos logos is the immanent principle of organisation that orders matter in its continual processes of movement. Okay. So what we need to do, it seems, is to move up to this geological perspective of time in order to realise that the apparently stable is not. But they suggest this is in fact something that can be incredibly dangerous. And again, we have these references to the schizophrenic and the drug user. What we want to do is try to capture their experiences without the horrible side effects, to capture their experiences without going mad, without having to rely on those kind of substances. And all of this material that we find in 1,000 Plateaus is already echoed in the logic of sense. And when Deleuze talks about this in the logic of sense, he concludes, or should we go a short way further to see for ourselves, be a little alcoholic, a little crazy, a little suicidal, a little of a gorilla, just enough to extend the crack, but not enough to deepen it irremediably, he concludes, how much have we yet to learn from Stoicism? Okay, and I couldn't agree with him more. It seems that if we go back and read a text, particularly the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, what we find is someone who's already tried to do precisely this. Okay, and I think that comment gestures that Deleuze had already noticed that himself. And it's interesting that all of that material that we see much later in 1,000 Plateaus, the seeds for it are in fact already in this, his Stoic book. Okay, so dissolution of the self, that's my fourth thesis on Deleuze's Stoicism. My fifth thesis is also drawing upon material in 1,000 Platos. So again, in this practical book, this manual, this guide for life, we also get what we might call a political theory in the broadest sense. And here I'm referring to the section on nomadology. Now, the section on nomadology, the idea that we should have a relationship to space that's one of continual movement rather than one of ownership of a particular location, is built upon a very important passage in Difference and Repetition, which is on the handout, which I'll read out. We must first of all distinguish a type of distribution which implies a dividing up of that which is distributed. A distribution of this type proceeds by fixed and proportional determinations. Then there is a completely other distribution which must be called nomadic, a nomad nomos, without property, enclosure or measure. Here there is no longer a division of that which is distributed, but rather a division among those who distribute themselves in an open space, a space which is unlimited or at least without precise limits. To fill a space, to be distributed within it, is very different from distributing the space. Okay, so we've got two conceptions of distribution: a distribution according to nomos and a distribution according to logos. So a distribution according to logos would be the sedentary farmer who comes along and, according to some kind of principle, divides up the landscape and portions parcels of land to various different people, divide up the space and distribute it to themselves. The nomads, by contrast, don't divide up the space, they distribute themselves across an open and undivided space. Okay? Now, as philosophers, you're all going to be very familiar with the word nomos from the sophists and the nomos physis debates. Now, there are a number of different meanings of the word nomos in antiquity, but there are two principal ones which are distinguished by accents. And I have to make sure I get it the right way around. Now, the idea of nomos that you're probably most familiar with is the idea of custom, convention, or law, which we find in sophists, which of course is contrasted with physis, with nature. Okay? But this is actually a relatively late conception, a late meaning of the word, an earlier meaning of the word, which is distinguished now by accents. But of course, accents are a late introduction. So, as we'll see in a moment, the word would have been inherently ambiguous in antiquity when people are writing in capital letters without accents. This other sense of nomos means pasture, the undivided, uncontrolled space outside the limits of the polis. And it's this earlier sense of nomos that Deleuze is, of course, alluding to. And drawing on the work of a French philologist called Laroche, he suggests that the origin of these two different meanings can be traced back to the common root of nemo, which it means to distribute. And so, and I'm not sure precisely how much pushing Deleuze is doing here on this particular point, but he suggests that his two notions of distribution both come out of this root of to distribute. So custom, convention, law is distribution in the sense of giving people what they're customarily due. You can imagine what goes on in a law court being a fair distribution, an equitable distribution according to the principles of justice, for instance. That's one type of distribution. And the nomads on the pasture distribute themselves and their animals across this undivided, uncontrolled, unallocated space. Okay. Now, my next passage on the handout, again under my fifth thesis, is a quote from Plutarch about the Republic of Zeno. You'll all be familiar with Plato's Republic. Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism, also wrote a Republic. Diogenes the Cynic also wrote a Republic. It was a fairly popular title for a book. And Plutarch reports, the much admired Republic of Zeno, the founder of the Stoic sect, is aimed at this one main point: that our household arrangements should not be based on cities or parishes, each one marked out by its own legal system, but we should regard all human beings as our fellow citizens and local residents, and there should be one way of life and order like that of a herd grazing together and nurtured by a common nomos. Zeno wrote this picturing, as it were, a dream or an image of a philosopher's well-regulated society. Now, you can see here the ambiguity of the word nomos. Like a herd grazing together, nurtured by a common nomos, immediately suggests pasture to us. But also, the suggestion is that we have a group of citizens following one way of life and order, i.e. one set of customs and conventions. So there's an ambiguity there. But nevertheless, a herd grazing together, the idea of nomos as pasture is clearly implied here. Okay? Now, this text, Zeno's Republic, is reported to have been written by Zeno when he was very young, under the influence of his teacher, Crates the Cynic. And Zeno's Republic is often interpreted within the context of Cynic political thinking, which is summarised in its key term of the Cosmopolitan. Diogenes the Cynic famously says, I am a cosmopolites, I am a citizen of the cosmos. I'm not a citizen of Athens or Rhodes or Corinth. I am a citizen, I affirm my citizenship to the whole of the cosmos. And it seems that what we have here in Zeno's Cynic-inspired political treatise, the Republic, is again this thought that citizens should not have their household arrangements based on cities or parishes, but instead should pledge their political allegiance to some common undivided space, the cosmos or nomos, pasture. Okay. So, my fifth thesis on Deleuze and Stoicism would be that the kind of political theory, if we can call it that we find in the Nomadology plateau, in fact, is part of a tradition that we can trace back through the early Stoic political thinking and back to Diogenes the Cynic and back to this kind of cosmopolitan tradition. We shouldn't attach allegiance to any particular location, any particular deme or polis, but instead attach our affiliation to an undivided, shared, common space, the cosmos or nomos. Okay, so another key Stoic theme, I think, within A Thousand Plateaus, although unlike the wonderful Spermaticos Logos quote further on, there's nothing whatsoever, I think, to suggest there's any kind of direct connection here whatsoever. From my mind, it's a happy coincidence for what I'm trying to suggest, but I don't think Deleuze had any knowledge of that particular fragment. Okay, so my final thesis on Deleuze and Stoicism. Now, the popular image of Stoicism, the image that you'll find if you open up the Oxford English Dictionary, for instance, is that the Stoic is someone who exhibits a kind of heroic fortitude in the face of adversity. The Stoic is the one who battles on no matter what. No matter what fate throws at him or her. Okay. Now, this sounds precisely like the sort of thing that one could imagine Nietzsche ridiculing when he talks about amor fati, and he suggests that we should affirm absolutely everything that comes to pass, that we should affirm fate. We shouldn't be battling on in the face of fate, taking the slings and blows and fighting on no matter what. Instead, we should be welcoming whatever happens. We should be accepting it with open arms, we would expect Nietzsche to say. And one can imagine, and I'm sure they're there, that Nietzsche will have some fairly damning comments about the Stoics on precisely this kind of point. Okay, so given that, it's rather surprising to find Deleuze saying in the logic of sense that Stoic ethics, on the handout again, Stoic ethics is concerned with the event. It consists of willing the event as such. That is, of willing that which occurs insofar as it does occur. And he goes on in the third passage, either ethics makes no sense at all, or this is what it means and has nothing else to say, not to be unworthy of what happens to us. To grasp whatever happens as unjust and unwarranted, it is always someone else's fault, is on the contrary what renders our souls repugnant. So the heroic Stoic, if we call him that, who battles on against fate, is of course attributing everything unjust that happens to fate, to nature as a whole, to God. So what's going on here? Okay? It seems as if Deleuze is trying to ally Stoic ethics with Nietzschean amor fati, which sounds a world away from what we normally think about Stoicism when we think about their attitude in the face of fate. So the courageous, heroic Stoic who battles on is effectively, we might say, in a state of endurance, which implies that what's happening isn't very nice, or a state of resignation, that one would just take it on the chin and think nothing about it. Whereas Deleuze, by contrast, is suggesting a notion of affirmation. Okay. Now, of course, the modern popular conception of Stoicism has a genealogy, and part of that genealogy is the 16th century Renaissance neo-Stoic that I've been working on, called Justus Lipsius. And the modern conception of Stoicism is basically his. He published this very important book, De Constantia, on constancy in the face of public evils, to give it its full title, in which he outlines a version of Stoic ethics, which has been tweaked slightly to make it amenable to a Christian audience. And this book, published in 1584, went through something like 80 editions in the 17th century. Okay? If you wanted to know what Stoicism was in the 17th century, you read Lipsius. Diderot's article on Stoicism in the Encyclopedia ends with a note on Lipsius, the most important of the modern restorers of Stoicism. So our modern conception of Stoicism is Lipsius' conception of Stoicism, which is very much endurance in the face of adversity. And Lipsius was primarily a scholar of Seneca. He produced an important scholarly edition of the works of Seneca in 1605. And if we go to Seneca, particularly Seneca's essay on Providence, you'll find loads of this stuff. You'll find all sorts of stuff about how we've no idea what God has determined for us. We've no idea whether the horrific things that come to us are part of some great divine providential plan that actually will be in our best interest in the end. We can't work out what God thinks. We've just got to take it on the chin like real men, and unfortunately the language is real men most of the time. And this is where Lipsius is getting this image of the Stoic attitude to fate, I would argue. Okay? But there are other Stoics. Seneca's just one among many. And if we turn to the other later Stoics, writing in Greek rather than Latin, in particular Marcus Aurelius, who I've already mentioned, but also Epictetus, who's roughly contemporary with Seneca, but a world away culturally. If we look at these thinkers, then we come across a quite different attitude towards fate. Okay? So, if we want a kind of a catchphrase for Epictetus' Stoicism with regard to fate, the famous passage is, do not seek events to happen as you want them to, but rather want events to happen as they do so, and your life will go well. Okay? do not seek events to happen as you want them, but rather want them as they happen, and your life will go well. What Epictetus is trying to suggest is that we should try to identify our own will with the will of the cosmos as a whole, and of course the cosmos is identified with God in Stoic physics. Okay. So, and again, in Marcus Aurelius, we have this idea that we should expand our horizons. We shouldn't see ourselves as isolated individuals living at this particular place, at this particular time. Instead, we should try to raise up to this broader cosmic perspective, this geo-historical perspective, in which we see all of the processes of the cosmos, with things constantly moving, constantly changing, and try to get beyond the boundaries of our own particular interests and concerns. Again, to try and reach a kind of a point of view of the cosmos, we might say. Okay? So in Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus, there's this idea that we should expand ourselves, we should try to go beyond the apparent boundaries of the subject in order to identify our own will with the will of the cosmos. Okay? So rather than external events appearing to be something outside and opposed to us, that assault us and that attack us, instead we should try to dissolve that boundary so that we see ourselves as part of nature, and we see those events not as alien to us, but in fact akin with us. And you can see potentially some of the resonances that you could pick up with Spinoza here, which obviously is useful for the genealogy I'm trying to map. Okay. And again, the Stoics will say that the only entity that is actually completely free is God. And the reason why God is free is because he has absolutely nothing external to him. All of us are surrounded by external objects, and those external objects limit our ability to act. Only God is completely free because God has nothing external to him. So the more that we can become like God, the more that we can identify ourselves with nature as a whole, the more we will be free. So this is why we should try to do this. So there are, if you like, two conceptions of Stoicism when it comes to attitudes towards fate. There's the Senecaean attitude of heroic endurance, and there's this Epictetan, Aurelian attitude of affirmation. And it's that conception of Stoicism that Deleuze is alluding to, I think. So those are my 6 theses on Deleuze's Stoicism. I think Deleuze is a Stoic. Despite the obvious differences between their two philosophies, despite the great differences between cultures, despite how much of Deleuzean ontology clearly isn't in Stoicism, despite various things in Stoic philosophy that there's no way that Deleuze could possibly affirm, the idea of providence, for instance, despite all of these things, there seems to be a profound deeper Stoicism within Deleuze's philosophy that Bernot was touching upon in my opening quotation. And it's a Stoicism that goes far beyond the few passing remarks that we find in the logical sense.